So I think we can start. More people will join after. So hi everyone again. So welcome to this webinar and thank you for attending. Today, Norman Menz will be discussing 5 strategies for mitigating digital risk for financial institutions. On the right side, you have a chat. Feel free to ask questions here. We will cover them during the webinar if relevant or at the end. And you will find also 2 polls that you can answer during the presentation. And in handouts, sorry for the accent, you can download this presentation and other resources also. So Norman, do you want to start presenting yourself?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Faustine. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Excited to be here today for our webinar as we look at 5 strategies for mitigating digital risk for financial service organizations. And so before we get started, I want to just spend a few seconds just providing a little bit of background about myself. I've spent the last 20 plus years, it's dangerous to say more than 20, so plus is appropriate, in the information security and cybersecurity space in the last 10 years in external risk, principally in third-party or affiliate risk, as well as vulnerability risk management and digital footprint monitoring. We're coming into the holiday season here, so we thought it would be good to have a fun presentation, share some of the trends that we're seeing, jump into some of the more exciting examples of some threats that we're seeing in our customers' digital footprint, principally in the dark web as well as clear web sources as well today. So for our agenda, we wanted to discuss 5 things and apologize in advance for the numbering. That's an artifact of the upload here. But the first area we want to talk about was just break down some of the common sources of risk in an organization's digital footprint. We'll start with a definition of what a digital footprint means to us here at Flare, discuss the impact of these risks when they're not addressed at the organization and how they potentially affect your operations as well as your reputation. Look at some interesting use cases, and so these are things that are topical that we're seeing from our research and development team, as well as from conversations with our customer. And we'll mix out both some findings, if you will, and also provide some color around that with some stories, some success stories, if you will. And then finally, we're going to cover off on 5 strategies that your organization can take today to identify and mitigate those risks. We'll, give you some steps to help protect. And then we'll finish it up with a Q&A. As Faustina said, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions. I'll try to keep an eye on them as we go through them. And if we don't get to them in the middle of the presentation, we'll pick them up at the end. So again, thanks very much for joining, and let's get started. As I said earlier, we want to talk about a definition of digital footprint because there's a lot of terminology used, and we look at the digital footprint very simply. We define a digital footprint as any assets or resources related to your company that can be found on the web. And so that's on the dark web, it's on the clear web. That information may be there by design, meaning it's intended to be there. That could be something like a DNS record, or it could be the presence of a system. It might be there because it's been posted by your marketing team and it's intended to be public. It might be there because it's inadvertently posted there by your employees by accident, or it might be there because of activity from malicious actors, such as a data dump or some other type of breach or exposure. And so the thing that's fundamental about the digital footprint is it contains assets that you know about or resources that you know about, those that you don't know about or hopefully not yet know about. So we want to talk to you about how you can discover those. And then finally, those that you might not be able to control or manage. And that's principally stuff on the dark web or other stuff that's posted out there that you don't have the ability, for example, to do a takedown or something like that. The other thing that's interesting about the digital footprint, and we've got a statistic here from Gartner, but there's about a 26% growth in adoption of cloud services in 2021. And we see even more rapid adoption in certain industries, and especially our target industry today as we talk about financial services. So we're going to start with the first poll. Faustine, if you don't mind popping up, that would be great. As I said earlier, according to Google, 83% of financial service organizations are actively adopting cloud services as part of their primary computing infrastructure. And so we wanted to ask everybody to answer this poll, and we'll take 20 seconds to give people an opportunity to respond. All right, excellent. Well, thank you for all who answered. So I'll just summarize the results here. So again, the question is, how confident are you that your data is protected when it leaves your environment? 17% of the group said that they were confident that their information was protected. The majority of the group, about 50%, said that they were not confident, and 33% said that they had no idea. And I think that's really typical of what we're seeing. So we've got this rapid adoption of cloud services. A lot of times information goes to cloud service providers and things of that nature, where the security controls and the paradigms that our teams are used to implementing to protect data are foreign. And sometimes we have that inadvertent data leakage. And certainly when information goes outside of our network and our control through malicious activity, obviously we have no control over that as well. So as we look here today, we're really trying to help organizations identify that information in their digital footprint and take some action on it. And sometimes that's going to be mitigation. Other times it's going to be remediation where possible. So as we alluded to before, there's a couple of common sources of risk, and that takes the form of really two things. So the first one is actors, and the second is location. If we take a moment to talk about actors, it's very exciting to get here. I'm relatively new to the team here at Flare, joined about 6 months ago. And clearly when we talk to customers and whatnot, there's a lot of interest and excitement and intrigue, if you will, around the dark web. And so on the dark web, we see malicious actors or malicious groups. We hear a lot about them. They get the most discussion in the news and things of that nature. But as I've spent the last couple of months here talking to customers, I'm finding that the predominance of risk to an organization exists in the clear web. So we're going to talk about that a lot. And that's coming from, inadvertent employee behavior, accidents, things of that nature. And so there were two interesting statistics when we now start to talk about employees or third parties. So these are, when we look at it from an intent-based perspective, these are people who have the right intent for the organization, but perhaps might take the wrong action. And so according to the recent Verizon data breach investigation report, about 85% of data breaches involve a human aspect. And if I think back over the last couple of years, that hasn't changed that much. The predominance is coming from human error. And then there's another statistic. So Stanford University did a study that was very interesting called the psychology of human error. And they found roughly 83% of data breaches were a result of human error. And then they actually went on to look at how organizational culture affected that. And in particular, organizations that were punitive towards employees who made mistakes, those employees were less willing to admit to those mistakes. And it was difficult to retrain people because there wasn't really a recognition of this or an acceptance of this. And it was also difficult to mitigate because, again, if people aren't admitting their mistakes, they may not tell you if something's wrong. And we're going to look at a couple of examples here today where it's clearly employee behavior that's resulted in some data risk. So those are the first area, which are the actors. And then the second one is the location, or if you will, kind of the sources of data. And so we have the dark web, right? And so these are things like data leakage through data breaches, ransomware attacks, things of that nature, credentials and access to organizations being sold on the dark web. And financial institutions in 2021 reported, over a 1,300% increase in ransomware attacks. It's clearly one of the biggest, I think, organizational threats that we have when we look at digital risk from, malicious parties, right? And then the second piece is the clear web side of this. And so the clear web is really everything outside of the dark web. And these lines start to get grayed. Given just a couple of examples here, they're certainly not inclusive. We had mentioned the organizational footprint containing things like your DNS records, services being exposed. And then we have other, if you will, public services such as GitHub. We have paste bin sites, which are very common forms for data leakage, other types of buckets, so Amazon S3, things of that nature, Microsoft blob storage, et cetera. And then, just generically, you can call it Google. So anything that's in the index part of the clear web that you can search via Google, that you can run Google Dorks against, et cetera, around that. You have a lot of that information, which are all, forms of sources of risk. So we'll dive into those. So we want to take the next few minutes to talk about some of the potential impacts. And the one that really becomes most obvious is the financial impact. And, looking again back at the last couple of years when we talk about the impact of a breach, we really trace it back to the loss of data. Now, the loss of data, by my definition, can be different things. In financial services organizations, I've argued that money can be data, and especially if we start looking at things like cryptocurrency or the theft of data resulting directly in the loss of money, through different types of scams or fraud. And so that financial, is really probably the biggest impact that we see facing an organization. That's either direct costs or indirect costs. And so we took a look at the cost of a data breach in the US. And interestingly enough, the cost of a data breach in the US is twice the average cost of a data breach for the rest of the world. So it's, our cost for our data breaches here in the US is very high. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a 6% year-over-year growth. And if we look particularly at financial services, and according to a recent IBM study, the cost of a data breach in financial services is about 34% higher than other data breaches on average. So, again, getting back to the biggest impact being on financial, it is considerable. And Accenture recently did a report where that they said from 2020 through 2024 that the cost of data breaches to U.S. financial institutions alone would top $340 billion. So it's a really big problem. And there's certainly ways that we're going to talk about that we can mitigate that through establishing better posture in our digital risk. And then in addition to financial, there's some other potential impacts, and kind of group them into 3 categories. So the one I think very clearly is the loss of the data itself. And this, I found to be very interesting. And again, another study from IBM that 44% of data breaches contain credentials, and those credentials could then be used to lead to other forms of compromise. In addition to that, you have other things from loss of data, loss of intellectual property, loss of customer information that could result in fines. Things like personally identifiable information or health information can result in loss of fines, and then other impacts on reputation. So if we move then into kind of the impact to loss of business and reputation, thinking back to kind of the seminal data breaches of the past, we can look at the Target data breach going back to 2010 and things of that nature, but huge impact on that. We continue to see them having an impact on consumer confidence and how our customers deal with us. But from a recent study, about a third of consumers would stop doing business with organizations that are breached, and another 85% of the consumers who've been involved in a data breach will tell others about it, so it'll have a negative impact, and many of them going out to social media. So we continue to see this be a big problem. And then another aspect that I wanted to take a look at was downtime, and specifically, I think for this audience being more technically focused, Gartner estimates that the cost of an outage from a network outage alone is about $5,600 per minute, or about $300,000 per hour. So really significant, if you will, kind of upfront costs. And when we talk about downtime, these are likely things like ransomware attacks, again, which are increasing with velocity and continue to represent a fundamental risk to organizations. So that we kind of highlighted a couple of the different impacts. We talked about, the different sources of risk in our digital footprint. And what I thought it'd be interesting to do was actually go through 3 use cases, and we can certainly expand upon them. And I wanted to get some that were focused specifically to financial services, but they're applicable to all organizations in general. And so we wanted to take a look at leak credentials and access. And this particularly is not necessarily a credential or password database being posted up to the internet. We see a lot where we'll have a major data breach, and then someone will upload a list of usernames and passwords. We're looking at leaked credentials and access. So in this particular example here, we're going to actually drill down and look for credentials or access to a system or a network being sold on the dark web. We want to look at loan fraud on the dark web as well. There's a lot of information that's being sold on the dark web. A lot of consumer information that can be used to obtain loans, and then there's also methods and techniques to use that information to defraud banks and other lending institutions. And then finally, as we've talked about, inadvertent employee behavior is a large source of data leakage. And so we've got an example that's, I think, applicable to most organizations, because there's very few organizations after we monitor for a while where we're not seeing something similar to this, whether it's GitHub or something else, but, sensitive information being leaked, again, through employee behavior. So let's look here at this first example of leaked passwords and credentials. And so this is an alert that one of our customers would have received, based on some activity on the dark web. In this case, it's the Genesis market. I've obfuscated some of the information, so this is a real data point or real event. And there's a couple of things that are interesting about it. Again, it's credential access that's being sold on the dark web. This particular item that's being sold has a number of different credentials associated with it. You can see some here are Amazon, Netflix, Spotify, things that people use as consumers. And then as we start to move through it, you see this auth.dppass.us and then a domain name. And so we have the ability, when we're doing searches, to identify interesting information about a customer based on their domain. But then we also have algorithms that look for things like identifying identity providers or other types of online portals that people would use for access. And so this is an alert that we received. If you then drill down on it specifically into the Genesis marketplace and you look at the information that's being sold, in this particular case here, for $113 US, you can gain access to 124 credential resources for this particular account. And so you see a lot of these are in the forms of cookies or sessions that are still active and available. And so you have things, again, that are very consumer-like, where you may have eBay or Best Buy, you have AliExpress, Virgin Mobile, Spotify, et cetera. But then as we look to it, we also have some potential financial information related to this individual. So Western Union, we've got Capital One. And then as we look to it even further, we have things like Office 365 and other things that are corporate resources. And so, it brings to light a number of things. It's inevitable that we will continue to have people using, corporate assets for personal information, which doesn't necessarily create an additional exposure here, except for some edge cases in terms of the types of sites they may go to. And I'm certainly not calling out all the resources here, but I'm sure we can see that, as this example evolves, we can start to wonder, what happened with this particular set of credentials. So let's actually look at an example here. And again, we're anonymizing it. So we're going to call the company Acme Company. And this particular individual whose credentials are being sold on the dark web, we're going to call Jack. But Jack went to a malicious site. It dropped malware onto his machine. That malware compromised access credentials. Again, these are oftentimes in the form of, they could be in the form of things like passwords and user accounts that are being taken from the machine, or they can be things like cookies and session information that can be used. As we saw before, these then get sold up on a marketplace, and then they can be purchased by a malicious actor. And so this particular one here is actually talking, several months ago, there was a big data breach at Electronic Arts, the game manufacturer. And this is actually modeling that. So the same type of activity occurs. As we saw, the alert came in for credentials being sold on the Genesis market. If those credentials are then bought by a malicious actor, in the case of EA, they were actually able to use those credentials to gain access. It had session information related to the, in this case, EA's Slack instance. With that, they were able to gain access to the employee Slack information, obtain confidential information, and then use that access to social engineer and essentially elevate that access and gain access and commit a data breach. And so this is one example of it. There's another example that had a better outcome that we had with a customer, where a customer received notification that one of their employees' credentials were being sold on the Genesis marketplace as well. They wanted to actually validate that information. And so working with their organization, they were able to acquire the credentials to demonstrate a proof. With that, they were able to gain access into their organization. And the ultimate outcome of that, obviously, in addition to changing or shutting that down, was, you know, some better awareness, employee training, and the implementation of additional technical controls to try to mitigate that. So these are two kind of real world examples that we see very commonly of access being sold on the dark web. And so for our second example, we wanted to look at loan fraud on the dark web. And I was talking to our research team while putting this together. And one of the things that the research team has observed, and we don't necessarily have a correlation to identify the pattern, and I've just taken the last year's worth of data, but as you'll see in the bar charts here, that the amount of loan fraud and loan information that's being sold on the dark web has a tendency to spike in the summertime. And, you know, we've got some theories to it, but again, we haven't proven those out. But you can see there's a lot more activity. And this is the last year. If I go back to the year before that, I'll see the same information. But what's really interesting here is that this particular, I pulled out a particular example here. So we've got dark Fox forum. We have a threat actor called AUS Pride, where AUS is Australian. I chose this for two reasons, and I know this audience is predominantly North American. Number one, didn't want to inadvertently expose anything. But number two, this particular actor is fairly well known to our research team. They have good credibility in terms of they're very good at selling validated fraudulent material. And so we wanted to just take a look at that. And so in this first example says, we kind of now start drilling down. You can see this particular event, what's being sold. You can see where it's being sold on Dark Force, and there's particular content. So in this case here, it's Australian personal loan application package. So this is typically giving you credentials or full information, for example, of a victim, and then ways in which you need to do that. In this case here, they're saying that you can make up to $25,000 Australian per day by applying for fraudulent personal loans, right? And this is dark web, so you can see the onion address here. You can see the date it was first seen. So this was just yesterday. And then as we go through it, we can actually drill down from this particular posting that's being sold. We can pivot to the threat actor, him or herself. And you can see the number of comments that they've had and posts, the different titles that they're using. When we first saw this threat actor back in 2019, their last post was today. Where they're shipping from, other identities that they'll go from. And then they also get ratings. So like a good, dark web citizen, if you've had good success with the seller, you can provide feedback. And so we have here all of the feedback here. And it's interesting, you can say like always a great vendor. I mean, these are things that we'd expect to see on an eBay transaction or something like that as well, including all of their positive feedback as well as their negative feedback. So I thought this was a fun one to show. And again, this is just one example. It's very typical of a lot of the things when you're looking, for example, at different types of financial or loan fraud. And then the final example we wanted to talk about was monitoring GitHub. I'd said before, Clear Web is really emerging to be one of the largest sources of digital risk. A lot of that's through employee behavior, as we've established already. And we start to see an emergence of threat actors, malicious threat actors using Clear Web sites and sources. in addition to dark web. But if we look at this example of inadvertent employee behavior, and again, this is something that I was amazed when we started looking at how often and how frequent this occurs. This particular example is from October. This is a very large global organization that everyone has heard of. We've tried to obfuscate it, but essentially what's happening here is that we've detected in a GitHub post, we've detected sensitive credentials. And in particular, if you look at it here, you'll see references to SF or Salesforce. And I didn't break down all of this, but essentially what we have here, I would assume, is we have a developer in the organization who's posted probably some utility or resource code to a public GitHub repository. And often what happens is when people are doing those commits, they forget to take out some of the resource files. In this case here, we've got a Java properties file. And that Java property file has the first part of it under the content preview is actually a token for Salesforce. The next one is the username, and then after that followed, we have the password. And we see this time and time again where people are providing information to other SaaS services. These may be the form of API keys or tokens, or they may be internal or external corporate resources. And this is a very big problem. One of the ways in which we deal with this is we essentially monitor the GitHub fire hose. And then anytime we see an interesting identifier or commit being made, whether it's by a particular actor containing a company information, brand, or domain, we'll clone the repository, and then we have algorithms that will look for things like secrets, credentials, and things of that nature. And that leads me to a second use case or example when I was talking to a customer a few weeks ago where they experienced something. So a lot of times as we talk about monitoring, we think it's very reactive, right? Something bad has happened and we can be made aware of it. We can try to mitigate it. But I had an interesting conversation with a customer who told me a story that actually got me really excited, and I wanted to share it here today as well, where very similar to this example with GitHub monitoring, where they got an alert about some activity that was occurring in the clear web that was inadvertent employee behavior. It also happened to be GitHub that contained user credentials, and these were to a corporate resource and not necessarily to a corporate-owned resource, not necessarily to Salesforce. And so within a few minutes of the post being occurred, the customer received the alert. They put their response process into place. The first thing they did was validated the account and the information, made sure it was correct. Then they seized control over essentially changing the password. And then what they started doing is they implemented monitoring in their environment to see if there was any activity related to it. And so within a few minutes of getting the alert, they were able to remediate it, change the password, do whatever that they needed to do there. And then they started monitoring. And within hours of this being posted, they started seeing malicious inbound activity attempting to use these credentials. And so I got excited, as I said before, because it really shows that, in this case, you can actually, and if you talk to this customer, they'll tell you that, through this monitoring, they're able to prevent a breach. And so I think, as security professionals, that's why we're here. We're here to help protect our organizations. Sometimes that's through awareness. Other times it can be through stories such as this, where a particular set of processes are in place to give an organization the right tools and resources to really have a positive outcome. So that concludes our 3 examples. And, as we look to get to kind of 5 strategies that you can implement today, we wanted to put forth another polling question about whether or not your organization has adopted a platform or a service to monitor your digital footprint. So please take a few seconds to respond to that, and we'll pick it back up here in about 20 seconds. All right. Well, very interesting results. So again, the question is, has your organization adopted a platform or service to monitor its digital footprint? There were 4 potential options. 1, your organization's already adopted a platform. 2, you're working with a service provider. 3, evaluating options, and 4, not a priority today. And so interestingly enough, 33% of the audience said it's not a priority today. And 67% of the audience said that they're evaluating options. And so kind of in combination, it's not much different than what we're seeing. Gartner actually recently when we talk about external and digital risk protection. So we've talked about, I think, all the things that potentially expose an organization to risk in their digital footprint. But generally, what we're finding is organizations are just starting to evaluate their options. And, Gartner predicts, really over the next 2 years, about an 800% increase in adoption. So the adoption rate is relatively low right now, but I think as organizations start to identify that this is a significant component of risk, that organizations are starting to evaluate their options. So thank you, everybody, for responding to that. So as we look to wrap it up, when we talk about the 5 strategies for mitigating digital risk, wanted to share some ideas here. And so the first one is interesting. So if I think back, been doing this for about the last 20 years, I can remember, SANS training, a lot of the information there. And there's a statistic that I've always reflected upon, and that's about 95% of all information security or cyber incidents are a result of lack of adherence to best practice. And there's any number of different controls that we may use to define best practice. We could have procedural controls, technical controls, et cetera. But oftentimes the preponderance of them is a lack of adherence to that best practice. And so, it's not the most exciting thing to say, but it's certainly one of the best deterrents that we can look at here. And so whether or not we look at employee errors we've talked about, or inadvertent exposure of a system with vulnerabilities that we may find out on the internet, a lot of the best protection and mitigation that we can offer to our organizations is through the adherence of best practice. And so that one will continue to ring true. The next one is education and awareness, right? So there's a great opportunity in the examples that we've given. We looked at that one developer who posted something to Salesforce. So we have the ability to monitor, and we can look at what our employees are doing and use those as an opportunity to provide training and build awareness in the organization. So when we see people do things that we don't want to see or that are quote unquote bad, we can go back and we can provide some education and training to them. The other thing we can do as an organization is we can make it culturally acceptable to recognize people's mistakes and use that to improve. And again, getting back to that Stanford study, if we create a culture that's more open and accepting of people's mistakes, not only does it create a better opportunity to provide education, but when those mistakes are made, it will make people more willing to step forward, acknowledge those mistakes, and then allow the organization to deal with that. And then the next one I wanted to talk about, which was really kind of interesting, right? So VMware did a study, and they said the adoption of technologies, and they specifically called out both machine learning and encryption, helps organizations reduce risk. And specifically, they actually tied it back to reducing the cost of a data breach. And so if we think back, it's about $8.6 million. This is the cost of a data breach here in 2021. According to this study from VMware, that organizations that have implemented encryption, other forms of machine learning, which likely are for things like detection and whatnot, can reduce the cost of their data breach by about 1.2 million to about 1.5 million. So you continue to see a good opportunity for the leveraging different technologies. And clearly, when we talk about both of those, they make a lot of sense in our space, both protecting the data and identifying risk. And then finally, the last two, I think, really apply specifically to your digital footprint. And like any security tool, the most important thing we can do, as we talk to security professionals and we talk with our peers, is really having a robust inventory. And that inventory can be difficult to maintain when we're talking about our digital footprint. Again, the resources, the things we know about, the things that we don't yet know about, and the things that we can't control. So that ability to have a direct map of what your digital footprint looks like as it's growing and as it's expanding can give you a big leg up, right? It's not unusual for us to detect, for example, a service on the internet that's, has RDP service exposed, or, something else that, is not, that either may not be an encrypted service, or maybe it's a database that's left out there. You know, a lot of times that's an accident. If you're monitoring your digital footprint and looking for that, you can discover those things very quickly. You can remediate them, not only address the specific problem, but you can address kind of the operational process that created that problem. And so that's very important. And then finally, the last thing is, you know, developing a set of procedures to respond to and mitigate the digital risk. And we're looking, you know, in some of the examples we've had here where, you know, you've got something that's been exposed. You can identify that very quickly. You can take it down if you need to. In other instances, what we've seen too, and we've got a case study where we had a large financial services institution reduce their incident response time by 95%. So it allowed them to respond more quickly. It allowed them to reduce the threat and also make, you know, better use of the resources that were available to them. And so those are kind of, if you will, the top 5 today. Love to hear both through your questions, you know, how you feel about that. Do you agree with these? Is there anything perhaps maybe that we should touch on as well? And with that, we'll move into the Q&A. So Faustine, I think you're going to help proctor some of that.
The first question is, do you find there is more risk to companies on the dark web or on the clear web?
Yeah, that's a really, it's a really interesting one. I think I touched on it a little bit where, you know, clearly the biggest, you know, source of risk, right? And it's interesting when we talk about that in terms of the frequency, it's probably more so on the clear web. When you look at intent though, which is really important for us to look at intent, you know, a lot of the intent of malicious actors, you know, can have potentially a more significant impact. So, you know, the dark web in and of itself is relatively small. I think it's something like 70,000 unique pages. We're finding across a lot of the dark web forums that there's a lot of reposting. There's certainly a lot of activity there, but I think the biggest source of risk is really on the clear web. The other thing that we're also starting to see is as I mentioned before, is we're seeing a lot of the malicious actors kind of move away from the dark web, give up some of the anonymity of it, not entirely. And there's a lot of, if you will, kind of things that we would have only seen in the past. We've got illicit forums, et cetera, on the dark web, where we're starting to see those on the clear web also. All right. Well, excellent. I think we will call that. I'd like to thank everybody for your time and attention and joining us here today. Please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear your feedback. And you know, team would be happy to talk to you. You know, certainly it's looked like a couple of you are evaluating solutions in this space. And if you'd like to hear more about Flair's approach to it specifically, we would enjoy the opportunity to talk to you. Otherwise, again, thank you for your time. Happy holidays to everybody. Be well and be safe.
Thank you.